He built her dreams with his blood, sweat, and sleepless nights. He believed love meant standing beside her, even when he had nothing. She became a star. He became invisible. But what happens when the man she betrayed rises higher than she ever dreamed? This isn't just love lost. This is revenge dressed in success. Marcus stood under the rain and watched the light through the huge glass windows. The building was bright inside. On the other side, a name glowed in lights. It was her name, Victoria. He felt the rain on his face but did not move. The world called it success. For him, it was the last payment made on a dream he had helped carry. The dream now belonged to someone else. Marcus grew up in a narrow street where the sun came late and bills came early. He learned to fix things young. If a neighbor's roof leaked, Marcus climbed up and patched it. If a woman's old dress tore, he sewed it with a careful hand. School happened when there was time. Work happened every day. He learned to be steady. He learned to be useful. He learned a slow patience that felt like survival. Victoria grew in the same street, but with different eyes. She watched the world in color. She loved the way new fabrics moved, the way bright lights made faces shine, the way a single design could stop a room. As a girl, she drew gowns on the backs of used envelopes. As a woman, she dreamed of a name on a marquee. She wanted to create beauty that people would remember. They met because Marcus carried a box of old buttons into a small shop. Victoria laughed at his careful hands. She thought his hands looked like someone who could make things last. He thought her eyes saw colors he had never noticed. The first months were simple and fierce. They shared bread, jokes, and plans. They promised each other that they would build a life, not because life handed things to them, but because they would make it themselves. When they married, they had no savings to speak of. They had a tangle of dreams and a tiny apartment above a bakery. The apartment had a small window that looked on a street where children chased cats and men argued about football. Victoria hung a single lamp in the middle of the room. Marcus bought a small table secondhand and polished it until it shone. The place smelled of yeast and late-night sewing. They were happy in a way that is loud and quiet at once. Victoria started making dresses for a few customers. She had no large capital. She had talent and a small machine she inherited from her aunt. Marcus carried orders, washed fabrics, stood at the stall in the market, and fed the cat when Victoria worked late. They were a team the neighbors admired. Every paycheck they received was split into small plans. Rent, food, thread, the savings jar under the mattress. Marcus always said, "One day, you will stand under brighter lights." He meant it with every breath. He believed more in her talent than in his own luck. He learned how to save without complaint. He told himself to eat less so she could buy that special fabric. He worked nights mending clothes and days carrying goods. He gave up small comforts quietly. He gave his time. He gave his sleep. He became the silent engine that kept their small world moving. Victoria worked until her hands ached. She perfected collars, learned to cut a curve like a painter, and stitched sleeves until the lining felt like skin. She did not just sew. She invented small touches that made each dress memorable. Customers began to whisper her name. A small blog wrote about a young designer with an old soul. The Vivu, the Quentin neighborhood bristled with small, proud noises. Marcus listened and smiled when she read him the praise over a cup of watered tea. Their plan grew into a single large chance. A local creative foundation announced a grant money, studio space, and a runway slot in the city's small fashion night. For Victoria, it was the door she had waited for. The grant application required a demo collection, a small show, and some funds to prepare. Victoria's sketches became brighter. She drew a title for the collection and called it Root and Rise. Her idea was not to follow trends. She wanted to weave the street into gowns, to honor the hands that made things, to bring the worn and beautiful into one frame. They counted pennies. Marcus added every spare coin to the jar. On market days, he carried extra orders from one side of the city to the other. He mended and repaired other people's mistakes to sell at a small margin. He refused help offers and believed that a man's work is pride. The neighbors whispered, "He works for her dream," some said with soft admiration. "Who knows if that will return," said others. Marcus did not hear this second kind of whisper. Or he chose not to. At night, when the city quieted, he and Victoria sat with the jar between them. She drew designs and he counted stitches. She read articles on color theory and he memorized them to make shopping lists easier. He learned fabric names and thread weights. He began to see pattern like a quiet map. He would carry her bolts of fabric on his back even if his own shirt frayed. He viewed each expense as a small seed. The collection needed money. Marcus sold his small guitar he had loved as a boy. He stopped going to the one tea stall where he liked to sit. He took on odd jobs that bruised his hands. Victoria would return from the studio and press his palms gratefully. "You are too much," she would say, and kiss his forehead. He would shrug and say, "You will shine." Their world tightened into purpose. The night before the grant deadline, they sat by the dim lamp and sorted final pieces. Victoria worked on a signature gown that would be the show's heart. Marcus ironed and measured, hands steady. He thought if she won, a light would open. When the result came, the call was a breathless thing. They had won. The foundation admired the honesty, the story, the heart of root and rise. The jar had been used. The guitar was gone. Marcus's fingers were raw. But they had one chance. The studio offered them a small space, and the runway would be the place where Victoria finally stood in the light. Preparation was a fever. Victoria rehearsed models while Marcus adjusted hems until the thread wore thin. He bought a cheap camera to record, learning angles so he could present a compelling portfolio. He worked until his back ached. A cough came and he ignored it, because there was no time to be sick when the scene needed mending. The night of the small fashion night arrived. The venue smelled of new polish and desperate hope. The crowd was small but keen. People from patrons to bloggers came to see the new talent. Victoria took the stage with a hand on Marcus's arm. That night, when she walked the first dress out, the room loosened and something like applause began. It was not thunderous. It was fuse-struck. The older women in the front row wiped their eyes. The small camera Marcus had bought caught the face of a blogger who leaned forward with bright interest. After the show, a single man from a boutique store offered a place for a small trunk show. A local photographer offered to post the collection online. The blog that had once mentioned her now wrote a long post. The internet watched. For the first time, a stranger called Victoria promising. Marcus felt a small swell in his chest. He remembered the nights in the jar and smiled, though his ribs hurt. This was the beginning. It was still humble. They still ate the same beans and still slept under the same lamp. But the net tightened around Victoria's name and lights began to follow. Investors are not always money at first. They are interest, and then offers. Someone posted her work. Someone else shared. The first small video that featured her designs got shared across the city, then across the country. Comments splashed like small bright pebbles. Fresh, honest, a new voice. The momentum grew faster than they could plan. A small dealer in the city proposed a pairing, a show for the winter market. Another magazine wanted an interview. Victoria floated between clients and models and sometimes stood beside Marcus with a new sparkle in her eyes. He watched it like a careful man watches frost. The happiness was real but thin. He had taught himself to be ready. The first large opportunity arrived as a message that felt like a thunderclap. A national design fair wanted a mid-season feature and a grant. The prize was large, studio space for a year, mentorship, publicity, and a contract that could change everything. The fair's curators said they wanted authentic narratives. Victoria's story, woven from the street and made by honest hands, fit their need. But the fair required money up front for fabrics, travel, and preparation. The grant had money but not enough. Marcus looked at the numbers and felt the familiar pressure in his chest. The community had rallied some support, but not the full amount. They needed one large investment or a serious sponsor. Without it, their place at the fair would be a memory. Marcus measured the small jar. He looked at the few notes left. He looked at his hands and realized how quickly time and weather had worn him down. He made a decision. He never liked borrowing. He never liked being indebted. He was quiet in his choices, but he also believed some doors require burning bridges behind them to cross. He went to the pawn shop and placed the watch his father had given him. It was small money, but it bought a bolt of silk. He asked friends for odd loans. He took double shifts fixing old lights. He mended a wedding dress in the night and delivered it at dawn. He brushed the grime from his palms and bought the most honest thread they could find. He learned to buy in bulk to save. He slept in the bus on the way to the market. Victoria watched him. She saw the sacrifices. She kissed his knuckles and said, "You are my backbone." She promised to do the very best. Her eyes sometimes filled with tears thinking of the watch and the jar. Her appreciation was raw and honest. She hugged him like someone who wears gratitude like a necklace. Together they prepared. Every night Victoria cut detail and Marcus measured and sewed. She designed the dress meant to be the collection's highest pulse. Marcus took counts, adjusted hems, ran for last-minute trims. He sometimes sat hunched near the window and watched as she worked, thinking of the shape of the dress in the elevator lights one day. The day of the national fair arrived. They traveled with careful hands and frayed socks. Marcus watched the bright, tense in the way other designers carried themselves as if they had been born under studio lights. He felt a small prick of doubt. Still, the first model walked and the crowd moved. The curators leaned in. The judges scribbled. When the awards came, Victoria heard Marcus hold his breath. The announcer said her name. Rugged applause erupted. Her phone struggled under the pressure of incoming messages. A leading fashion site requested an interview. An investor, someone with a tidy hat and a sharper smile, asked to meet for coffee in the city. Victoria stood in the middle, flushed like a shy actor after a long rehearsal. Marcus felt it like a warm knife. It was joy, but it had a weight. From that day, her name did not stop. She was featured, interviewed, and invited. The investor paid for an expansion. The boutique owner offered to import the first line. Fans left messages that called her a genius. Profiles showed her designs in clean frames. People watched the video Marcus had shot months before. He saw his own hands in slow motion on a screen shared by strangers. He felt pride and a small sliver of fear that they were moving too fast. As Victoria rose, small changes came like stains on a shirt. She took better care of her hair. She began to wear a different kind of smile in public, a measured, half-smile trained to bewitch. She learned to carry herself like a flag rather than a neighbor. Her speech made room for softer vowels. She began to say the word "we" in press interviews, and then quickly correct to my team. His name was there in the small print sometimes. Her thanks in interviews were brief and polished. Marcus never complained in public. He told himself that talent needs care, and that love must stand firm. At home, he mended the hems she brought and listened to her plans. He believed that his work in the nights would become a quiet anchor. He continued to save, partly out of habit, partly because he thought some storm might come. But the world outside their small apartment began to see Victoria differently. The investor who promised coffee took her under his umbrella. He offered a studio with a bigger budget. He brought people who spoke in dollars and calendars and metrics. He suggested a more commercial line alongside her art. He wanted to scale. He wanted returns. For Victoria, the scaling looked like lightning. She had long dreamed of larger rooms and more lights. She said yes. She began hiring assistants. She moved into a shared studio in a modern quarter. Marcus helped with the move until he could no longer buy the boxes. He watched as her name printed on banners with a font that did not look like the paint of their old neighborhood. He watched as new faces came to the studio, people whose laughter sounded like a song he didn't know the words to. Very early one morning, when the city was thin and the street lamps still hummed, Marcus sat on the stairwell outside the studio. He had a small paper cup of tea and an empty head. He saw models laughing behind the glass and managers with lists. He felt both pride and a wound. He reminded himself that he had done this by loving work, by patience, by steady hands. He traced a pattern in dust on the step and thought, "This is how it must be. She will bring us home." But slowly, notice by notice, requests changed. Where once offers came with tears and gratitude, they now came with fine print. Her new circle mentioned images, brand collaborations, partnerships with foreign designers, guest spots on shows. They said things like scale and global positioning. Marcus listened as a man listens to a storm warning, and he trusted that his love could hold any wind. Then a small thing appeared, a message on her phone that read, "We can push her into markets. Get the investor to lead. He trusts us." The message was from a manager in the investor's network. Victoria smiled without showing the screen. She said, "This is big." Marcus held her hand and said nothing. Inside, he felt the first creeping of an unknown fear. Friends began to ask subtle questions. A neighbor who once complimented the sewing now asked, "Does she still make what she loves?" Marcus thought of the dress that had moved the older woman in the crowd. He believed that art can survive success if kept honest. He believed Victoria could keep honest. Months bent into a new rhythm. Victoria traveled. She took pictures by marble towers and wrote long captions. Marcus made the meals. At home when she was away and ironed the shirts she needed for meetings. He kept buying bolts of thread and small trims. He saved receipts in an envelope labeled studio needs. He worked harder than ever. The turning point came with a single phone call. An international magazine wanted a feature, but they wanted a different kind of line. They wanted a glamorous view of her work and the story that sold easily. Victoria accepted. The investor offered more money and a showroom in a prestigious street. The manager suggested a launch party where donors could meet her. Marcus watched the calendar fill fast and dense as beehives. His sacrifice had made the first door open. He had believed that love would mean they would step through it together. But then the door began to hinge on other hands. Marcus realized that love and success were not the same thing. They were different currencies. One buys space, the other steals it. Late one night, as rain tapped on their window and the small lamp cast shadows, Victoria brought home a contract. She read passages aloud about royalties and production lines. Marcus listened and nodded. He was good at listening. He had become good at it over years. He looked at the clause about creative control and realized it meant more than a line in legal language. It meant who could say yes and no, who could decide which shape would be the next signature, and how the studio would expand. "Are you sure about this?" he asked quietly. "They want to steer direction." She looked at him with a tired, bright face. "It's the chance, Marcus. If I don't work with this, someone else will take the space. You know that. This means visibility. This means real reach." He thought of the small jar under the mattress and the nights he had given away. He thought of the watch in the pawn shop and the frayed sleeves. He swallowed and said, "Then do it." The contract was signed. The lights got brighter. The invitations multiplied. The investor provided a small set for a commercial shoot. The studio moved into a better rent district. They invited press and tastemakers. Victoria stood under the camera and became a face of a new kind of fashion that was both art and sale. Marcus watched from the corner the day they officially opened the new studio. He greeted old customers and stood near the coffee table. Around him, assistants moved like a trained flock. Victoria moved like someone whose shoulders had been given more space by money. She wore a dress Marcus had once dreamed of seeing her in. The crowd clapped and the social feed lit up. Marcus felt his chest tighten with something unnameable. At some point that evening, a man in a tailored suit came by and put his hand lightly on Victoria's shoulder while laughing. The man had a certain ease with power, that quiet way wealth moves a person. Marcus watched that small touch and felt a cold that had no rain to wash it away. After that night, offers intensified. So did the distance. Victoria started to spend nights away, at meetings and events he could not imagine joining. She started to change her stories about the old street. The warmth of the lamp and the bread of the bakery became a line in a charming anecdote rather than the foundation of a life. New friends arrived wearing polished shoes. She spoke of timelines and campaigns. The words sounded beautiful, and to Marcus, empty. He did not stop helping. He still picked up trims and measured lengths. He still kept the small book of receipts and drove to markets for last-minute needs. He still ironed shirts and said, "You will be fine." Only his voice had a narrower pitch now. His patience had a seam stitched tight. One evening, when money arrived from a large client for the line, Marcus counted the checks. The numbers were larger than anything they had before. He set aside his small fraction and folded them into the envelope labeled home. He put the rest in a separate envelope labeled studio. He believed in the dream. He believed in Victoria's name, but the dream began to shift into a monument that sometimes kept no room for the man who had carried it. Victoria's name appeared on screens and in clean columns. She began to attend gala dinners where names were memorized and cards exchanged. Marcus tried to feel proud. He tried to feel glad. Mostly he felt the thin ghost of being left behind. The first doubt that cut open and made a visible line between them came like a silence. It was a weekend when Victoria had an interview across the sea. She would leave for 2 weeks. Marcus cleared the studio calendar and planned to sew through the nights. On the morning she left, they kissed in the doorway and promised a phone call like they always did. Her suitcase closed and her cab sped away. Weeks later, he stood by the studio window and watched her interview hot on a screen. She spoke about her muse and her boldness. She spoke about boundaries and how her vision needed scale. The interviewer asked about the support she had. She spoke deftly and named names in a polished, professional manner. Marcus listened. When she returned, she walked into a world that had slightly changed its furniture. There were interns who addressed her with a formal Ms. Her voice had learned a new cadence. She mentioned a plan for a partnership that would require a different kind of control. The word control sounded to Marcus like the small press of a hand that locks a door. He asked, "What about the studio control?" She looked up with a tired, sincere gaze. "Marcus, this is growing. We need people who have experience with big accounts. We cannot be sentimental." He swallowed. The word sentimental felt like a judgment. He was sentimental in the only ways he had, in the careful mending of a hem, in the small jar under the mattress, and in the nights he had worked while she slept. He was sentimental and steady. Now the world seemed to demand a new kind of heart. A subtle distance began. It took weeks, then months. Where once they planned in the middle of the night, they now passed plans by note. The shared jar became 2 envelopes. The laughter changed tone and grew fewer. He tried to ask her about the new contracts, the changes, and she told him gently that decisions required a different structure. She kept thanking him for the help and whispered, "You made this possible." But those words, while true, felt like a farewell. Neighbors remarked that success often asks a wife to stand on heights that do not include the man who helped her climb. Marcus heard the gossip and held his tongue. He wanted to be the patient scaffold. But scaffolds eventually get replaced with steel. Months later, a quiet but clear break arrived. The investor proposed a new board. The proposal asked for creative control to migrate to a more formal structure. He hinted that having a partner with a background in production might help, someone who was less sentimental, someone with a portfolio of high-scale work. It was a message sent in business language, but the undertone was personal. Marcus stepped back and watched the room where they had once measured stitches. He felt both pride and a hollow. He had built much of that space with his hands. He had sold small things to buy silk. He had been the silence when a deadline ate their sleep. He thought, perhaps naively, that his presence would always be part of the line. He thought of the jar under the mattress, and the watch that was sold to, by the first promptings of success. Then the message came quiet and clean. Victoria was offered a choice: continue with the current investor, structure and guarantee wide distribution, but reduce the small team control, or reject the investor and keep the studio small and slow. She called Marcus to her office and folded her hands. "Marcus," she said softly, voice steady, "this could change everything. We can't be both a large brand and a small atelier. Someone must make the choice." He looked at the empty space where her old dress pattern used to hang. He thought of the nights and the jar and the watch. His hands were steady as ever. He thought about the dream he wanted: a small house, a child's laugh, the simple steady rhythm of days. He thought about the dream she wanted: lights, names, and stands that clapped for art. He realized that sometimes to protect a dream, an investor asks the dream to be different. He also realized that people change when the world rewards a different shape. He listened as she explained the scale and the need for structure. Cassandra of money and deals had arrived on their doorstep. The language on contracts sounded neat, but it measured where each name stood. She reached across the table and took his hand. "We built this," she said, eyes earnest. "You built this." He wanted to stay with the hand that had never stopped working for the dream. He smiled and nodded, but in a quiet corner of his chest, an ember flickered. Not anger, not yet. A thought like an ember that might become flame. That night he counted the receipts and the hours. He sat on the studio floor and thought about the future. He thought about whether small hands could hold large rooms. He thought about whether the person who helped lift the curtain would always be invited to run it. Marcus did not make a choice immediately. He did not storm. He kept working. But inside, a small decision began to grow like a root. He would not surrender everything without a voice. If the world wanted a big name, he could prove that the name he helped found could be more than one person's echo. If the world demanded scale and a trait of soul for recognition, he would do it on his term. The seed of his plan was not revenge born of hatred. It was a quiet promise that he would not be erased. He would learn. If the road asked for new skills, he would get them. If the world required different language, he would study it. He would rise in a way that would make the difference between them visible. He would still love Victoria. Love does not die easily. But he would not be invisible. The days after the betrayal felt like a storm that refused to pass. Marcus sat alone in the dim room of his rented apartment, a cracked mirror hanging on the wall, the faint hum of the city bleeding through the broken window. His hands still smelled of the fabric he used to stitch for Victoria's dream project. Every inch of that project carried his sweat, his time, his soul. He had built her dream like it was his own. And she left like he was nothing. Victoria's face flashed in his mind. The night she told him she was moving on, she didn't cry. She didn't tremble. She just looked at him as if he was a chapter she'd already finished reading. Marcus clenched his fists until his knuckles turned white. Greater than, "She built her empire on my back," he whispered to the empty room. "Now, I'll build mine over hers." This was not a broken man talking. This was the beginning of something darker, colder, sharper. Marcus had nothing. No savings. No fancy clothes. Not even enough money to afford proper fabric anymore. But what he had was fire. It burned in his chest every time he remembered Victoria's voice saying, "I can't be with someone who's not growing with me." He got a small job at a dusty workshop in a forgotten corner of the city. They stitched cheap dresses for street markets, but Marcus wasn't there for the money. He was there to learn. Every night after work, when the others left, Marcus stayed back watching, cutting, stitching, creating. He practiced late into the night, sewing until his fingers bled. His designs were simple at first, but slowly, they changed. They began to breathe, to speak, to carry emotion. While Victoria stood on grand runways, Marcus hid behind old machines. But in those quiet corners, a legend was being forged. Months passed. He stopped counting the days. He didn't need to. Marcus began selling small designs at street stalls. A scarf here, a simple dress there. People started to notice the unusual detail, the way his designs told a story without saying a word. One night, an old tailor named Mr. Holly approached him. "Who made this?" The man asked, holding one of Marcus's hand-stitched pieces. "I did," Marcus replied quietly. Mr. Holly studied him for a long moment and then said, "You don't belong on the streets. You're crafting feelings, not fabric." That sentence hit Marcus deep. It wasn't praise. It was a challenge. With Heil's guidance, Marcus started meeting young, unknown designers. People like him rejected by the elite, full of fire. One by one, he built a small circle. They didn't have money, but they had dreams sharper than knives. And Marcus, he had a reason. While Marcus worked in the shadows, Victoria was everywhere. Her name flashed on fashion magazines, interviews, and trending hashtags. Her project had become a global sensation. She walked on red carpets with powerful people. She smiled like the queen of the world. She often appeared on live interviews, talking about her journey. She never mentioned Marcus. Not once, but every time Marcus passed by a billboard with her face on it, a chill ran through him. It didn't break him anymore. It fueled him, greater than. "Shine, Victoria," he thought bitterly. "Shine while you can." 2 years after she left, something changed. Marcus stood in a small, half-broken warehouse with his team of young designers. Their hands were rough, their clothes torn, but their eyes were full of fire. On the table lay his first real collection, Ashes to Empire. Every stitch carried his pain. Every fold held a piece of the man she betrayed. When the first showcase happened, it wasn't at a fancy hall. It was in an abandoned subway tunnel, lit with string lights. But the people who came were stunned. The designs were raw, powerful, emotional. No influencer could fake that kind of soul. The next morning, a headline appeared on a small fashion blog, "Greater Than. The underground designer who made people cry with fabric." It went viral. Victoria was in a meeting when her assistant whispered, "Have you heard of this new designer? Marcus Gray?" Her pen froze mid-air. Marcus, that name she tried to bury under fame. She forced a smile. "No, and I don't care." But that night, she couldn't sleep. She opened her tablet, searching for the name she once took for granted. Marcus Gray. His designs were bold, fierce, honest, and trending. A small, sharp pain grew in her chest. "Greater than." "No," she whispered. "He can't surpass me." Not him. But deep down, she already knew he wasn't the same Marcus anymore. Within months, Marcus's brand exploded. He was invited to the biggest fashion gala of the year. Celebrities wore his designs. Magazines called him the storm from the underground. But Marcus remained silent in interviews. No drama, no love story. Just focus. Just fire. Victoria, on the other hand, was starting to feel cracks in her empire. Her last collection was called Eclipse, but critics called it emotionless. They said, "The soul is missing." She blamed her team. She blamed the market. But deep down, she knew the truth. She had lost something real. She had traded Marcus's loyalty for flashing lights. And now those lights were starting to dim. It was at a fashion gala under a ceiling of glass and gold. Marcus arrived wearing his own black suit, simple, elegant, sharp. Cameras turned toward him like he was gravity itself. Victoria stood at the other end of the hall. For the first time, their eyes met after years. The world around them blurred. It was just him and her. She walked toward him with a forced smile. "You've changed." Marcus tilted his head slightly. "No, I just stopped being invisible." "You've made quite a name for yourself," she said, trying to sound casual. But there was a thin thread of jealousy in her voice. He gave a small laugh. "I didn't make it. You did. You lit the fire when you left." She froze. Before she could reply, a famous designer approached Marcus. "Marcus, we're honored to have you here. Your collection changed everything." Victoria stood there ignored, like background noise. For the first time, she wasn't the center. Weeks passed. Marcus's new line dominated the market. Orders flooded in from all over the world. His team grew from a handful of dreamers to hundreds of passionate creators. Victoria, on the other hand, started losing clients. Investors pulled back. They said her designs were outdated. Her name was fading, and the cruelest part, her empire was crumbling under the shadow of the man she betrayed. She tried to fight back new collections, new PR campaigns, but nothing worked. She was chasing a ghost she created. One night, she sat alone in her giant, empty showroom. Her eyes fell on an old photo, her and Marcus, sitting on the floor, surrounded by sketches. That was before the fame, before the betrayal. The Grand Fashion Championship was the biggest event of the year. Every designer dreamed of that stage. Victoria had won it once. Now Marcus stood where she used to. When Marcus walked on the stage with his new collection, the crowd went silent. The lights dimmed. Music swelled. Every model carried a piece of his story. Pain, betrayal, rebirth, power. The audience rose to their feet before the show even ended. Marcus didn't just win the event, he owned it. Victoria watched from the back, hands trembling. The announcer's voice echoed through the hall. "Greater than." And the Fashion Empire Award goes to Marcus Gray. The same hall that once celebrated her now screamed his name. She lowered her head. Her eyes burned. Marcus didn't look at her. Not once. That night, Marcus stood on the rooftop of the new headquarters of his fashion house. The city lights shimmered below him. His journey had started in darkness, in pain, and now he stood on top of the empire he built from ashes. He closed his eyes for a moment. Victoria's betrayal, his sleepless nights, his hunger, his bleeding fingers, everything flashed before him like a storm, collapsing into silence. He didn't need her apology. He didn't need revenge to hurt her. His success was loud enough, greater than. "She left me for a crown," he whispered to the night, "but I became the kingdom." And somewhere in the city, Victoria sat alone, staring at the headlines that had once belonged to her. The man she left behind had become the man the world couldn't stop talking about. Marcus didn't destroy Victoria with words. He didn't beg for payback. He simply rose so high that her betrayal looked small beneath his feet. Revenge isn't always about hurting someone back. Sometimes it's about becoming everything they thought you couldn't be. It's about turning their goodbye into your beginning. And Marcus, he didn't just get even. He won.